Hi friends, and welcome to a review of the Sony A7S Mark III. Now, I'm not going to be talking about anything other than this camera being applied to street photography. So if you came here for video spectacle testicles, then you're not going to get them. And don't try it, because I will start crying. We just recently got this camera and I'm very happy with it. I went on a nighttime photo walk the other day to test its low light capabilities. We'll get to that in a moment, but first let's talk about specs and such. This has a 12 megapixel full frame Exmor BSI CMOS sensor. It has 16-bit raw this is relevant. 5-axis steady shot image stabilization, 759 point fast hybrid autofocus. And of particular importance to us today, ISO 40 to 409,600. Holy Moses. And 10 FPS. So I'm going to tell you about what I enjoy in this camera in my short time using it thus far. One is the new menu system. They completely rebuilt it. It's much easier to navigate and find things that you're looking for. It has a sort of tiered system that reminds me of that One View and Finder, which can be useful sometimes. Another thing is buttons. They're completely different on this one in comparison to the A7 Mark III. They have much more depth, much more travel. They feel arcade-like. There's a lot of action. I love them. I like buttons and dials. Buttons and dials. Like, it might not communicate here, but that's a beefy record button right there. Got some extra buttons on the dials themselves that you have to push down in order to turn the dials. That's very helpful for not turning the dials when you don't want to, especially exposure compensation if you need that. Seems to have snappy autofocus in low light, and the grip is beefy. It is more beefy than the A7 Mark III. In fact, the body is actually thicker than the A7 Mark III, which I don't mind. For a while, we went into this zone, in particularly the phone world, of making everything smaller and smaller and smaller. I like a company that is okay with making things a little bit bigger if they need to be. Now, the AVF is something special. It is considerably sharper and better looking than the A7 III. I am very pleased with that. A lot of photographers shoot half or more using the LCD screen on the back. I shoot almost exclusively using the AVF. Hi, Editing James here. Upon review of this footage, I realized that I said AVF instead of EVF 2 times. I don't know why. I may have been having a mini stroke. I seem to be fine now. Anyway, back to talking about the HVF. I used to use my optical viewfinder on my Nikon D600 here, is quite dusty. I've always shot that way, and if you don't shoot that way, then I respect you a little bit less. Okay, moving on. Something that got me quite giddy when I realized is that this camera allows you to shoot in 4 different aspect ratios. So we have the normal 3:2 and 16:9 of the A7 Mark III, but on this one we have 4:3 and 1:1, aka square. Let's say you don't want to wait until post to see if you could make the image square, and you want to frame it up while you're there that way. This is the camera for you. Or it's a camera for you, considering that Fuji cameras also do this. Maybe, I don't know, Canon. Maybe Canon does. Somebody tell me, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's nice. And one thing I learned about that is that if you shoot RAW, it will do this non-destructively. So you can go into Lightroom and uncrop it to a full 3:2 to use the entire sensor if you would like to. But when you're out, you're able to frame it up that way. And there's an advantage to that. And of course, I did want to mention the most major upgrade for this camera, and that is the flip out screen. More important if you want to shoot video with it, pointing at yourself. But it's there. Okay, on to the quick nighttime photo walk that I went on to test out this camera, see how it performed in low light, see how it worked as a street camera. I wandered around downtown Salt Lake City on a Friday night. It was quite pleasant. Excuse me, bro. I'm a street photographer. I take photos of interesting people that I meet. I thought you and your dog were wonderful. I was just wondering if I could take a quick portrait of you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, what's your name?
Hayden.
Hi, I'm James.
Nice
Good to meet you.
James.
All right, I'm just gonna take a quick shot.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Now I want to mention that most of the photos that I took on this night were quite underexposed and I had to pull them back up. And this photo is a fantastic example. I had a shot of a man with a dog riding on his back. I'm not sure how it happened. Maybe the dog was Velcroed to him. Anyway, it made for a nice photo. We can see the original and then the exposure corrected version and then the final version with crop included. This was taken with a 50mm at f4 at 100th of a second at ISO 4000. Now I tried to shoot a fair bit in f4 and not using the full potential of this lens, which is 1.8. And the reason why I did that is I figured it would be the most applicable to the most people watching this. In other words, your use case may not include an f1.8 lens, but you probably have a lens that can go to f4. And I mean, you can see that this shot is plenty usable. It's a fine street shot. So thank you to the gentleman who let me take his photo. Next we have a shot of a fellow who looks kind of like he belongs in Phantom of the Opera, but not quite at the same time. And he had a flute and an electric cello, and he also beatboxed. So this is the kind of person that you want to have over on Friday if you're having pizzas with the friends. Because like, oh, we're bored. And then he just pulls a flute out of his back pocket. He starts playing Oh Canada and everybody loses their mind. This one was shot at 2500 ISO at 50mm, f1.8 in this case, at 100th of a second. So you can see the difference between this photo and the previous photo. Also, yes, I know I focused on his arm. I don't want to talk about it. Next we have a photo of a fellow in front of a tattoo shop. This one was pretty close to correct exposure upon taking it. You can see the original exposure corrected and final once again. This one was taken at ISO 8000, 50mm, f4 at 100th of a second. There's some grain, but it's minimal and it's pretty clean looking. The colors look great, nice and sharp. I took this one of a family having a dinner together. The kid is playing on the phone because family life is obviously far too boring for him. It was taken at ISO 5000, 50mm, f4 at 100th of a second. Then I drove up to the Utah State Capitol building and performed a test where I held the camera, handheld, in front of the Utah State Capitol building and took the same photo at various ISOs. So these photos were taken at f4 at a 100th of a second between 16 and 20 millimeters. This first photo was taken at 16,000 ISO. Then moving on up, we get to 51,200 ISO. Maybe a hair more grainy and a bit less sharp. This one was taken at 80,000 ISO. This one was taken at 160,000 ISO. And finally, this one was taken at 409,600 ISO. The highlights on the building are blown out. Here we have another one taken at 409,600. I brought the shutter speed to an 800th of a second so that the highlights wouldn't blow out in the building. This one also has a person in it walking by. You can see at this point that the person looks quite ghostly with how soft the image is and with all of the grain. It's quite extreme. Also, I noticed that if I turn on profile corrections at this ISO, the grain structure has this funny ring happening near the center of the image. Here's another test I did where I pointed the camera at my hand at f4 at 100th of a second at 204,800 ISO. And you can see that there's some ghostly blurs around my fingers. This is not a shutter speed thing because the shutter speed was not too slow that it would create that type of blur. This is happening because it's so dark and I'm pushing the ISO so high. I intentionally shot into a very dark area of the grass to really challenge the sensor. Here's the same photo at 64,000 ISO. The original image was much darker. I brought it back up and we have a very similar result. Then I made my way up to an overlook where I took a photo of the city. This was taken at 12,800 ISO. Once again, quite dark. I pushed it back up. It's rather grainy, but it's totally usable for my purposes. This one was taken at 35 millimeters at f4 at a 100th of a second. Then I took this photo at 3200 ISO, 50 millimeters, f1.8 at a 100th of a second. You can see the original the only light that you can see in the images is the lights from the city, little points of light. But I brought it up and you can see that there are people in the frame. And then finally I went to a spot where trains come by and took this photo at 3200 ISO, 50mm f1.8 at 100th of a second. So with all of that said, what are my thoughts on this camera? I say this would be a fine workhorse of a camera for street photography. It is quite large, and if you put a large lens on the front of it, it's going to be even more large. So if you want to go out with prime, not a bad idea. It's a good full frame camera. It's a fantastic full frame camera for shooting on the street. It has everything you will ever need. But if size is an issue for you, you could consider the new A7 Compact. That's an idea. Or you could drop down to an APS-C or even a micro four thirds sensor, get a Fujifilm, something of that sort. All these cameras are roughly in the same ballpark, and I would say the biggest difference between them in terms of the characteristics of the images they will create is the sensor size. So it really depends on your purposes. But with that said, if you do want to buy this camera, I have a link below. It's an affiliate link, and it will support what I'm up to here if you decide to use it. And I would greatly appreciate that. You'll be in my heart forever, and I'll tell my grandchildren about you. Another thing that would make me tell my grandchildren about you is if you enjoyed this video, if you hit the like button or if you subscribe, that would be something I would greatly appreciate. If you have any questions, anything I did not cover in this video about this A7S Mark III, then please feel free to comment below. I'd be happy to engage with you. Feel free to engage with me in the direct messages world on Instagram or Twitter at James the Red. I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you so much for watching if you made it this far. Goodbye.